nó trò lo của quốc bên đây ư an của bọc đây cùng bên đây cái đi thằng là mi mà đôi đại dạo bọc bằng cuốn mà còn sau để mong có tông còn làm nó rụt nhưng mà riêng cho phút mà để rồi đằng khi hay về sự một thời gian ấy còn làm đi đang còn từ rong lui lù bên mà nấu ít để ta bang ăn lù bên đang corner in mà đừng làm anh đi cả Bahnar Tukrong níu nói và trớp ăn cái đi đang lù bên và anh nó còn rong lui bên trung a sợ sự lệch thời giờ là đang ấy và bên vừa măng dọc đang làm anh thoại là Montagnard Smith sons of the Gordon Smith history recounts the curious momentary now để nó chơi đề tôi bốc ăn cái đi đang lù bên và anh nó còn từ rong lui bên trung a sợ dọc đang nằm minh hợp xin trang bari chín sợ lễ cũng để lúc làm vẫn bốc đã nành nè cũng để mình vào xin răng mình chỉnh mồi mà lấy vẫn bốc làm tròn đâu chỉnh tròn tal tròn nào và vẫn có măng bằng tấn có làm lù ngày America tộc vẫn đừng luôn sợ hay nằm mình vào xin răng bari chín có bọc có thó Gordon Smith nào và cái gì đang của phân có măng bằng ram chẳng hạn đại.
The road winds and twists through deep valleys, very wild and beautiful. The tropical vegetation is luxuriant. We stop to look at two wild-looking men as they stand quaking with fear at the sight of us. These are the truh, the blood hunters we call them, for they not only sacrifice animals, but human beings. I try to ask them questions, but they understand none of the dialects I know. They cling closer to each other, their right hands resting nervously on the hilts of their long knives. It is only agitating them to talk longer, so with a smile, I pat them on the back and go on. My grandfather wrote those words and took these pictures, and for years entertained me with stories of meeting exotic cultures. The missionary's zeal to convert has long been controversial, but through the images he left behind, I've tried to imagine why missionaries set out to change the world.
Long before the first Americans in combat fatigues came to Vietnam with their battalions, this one in a tropical suit came with his family. Many Americans gave their lives to this place, waging war. He gave his life too, nearly 50 years of it, pursuing peace. Gordon Smith had a different dream for Indochina. What if his dream had been the one that came true? In the year 1929, a wood-burning steamer churned up the Mekong River toward a small town called Truh. On board were Gordon and Laura Smith, full of apprehension but determined and excited. They were going to establish a small Protestant church in a place that never had had one. They were on their first assignment as missionaries. They knew it was going to be a hard life. It turned out to be harder than they imagined.
Cambodia is a hot, damp country and not fit for white folks to live in. So many different diseases have visited us that it's hard to recall them in order. Without a let-up, one or another of the four of us have had dysentery, malaria, sore eyes, fainting spells, hemorrhages, measles, bronchitis, enteric diarrhea, and bronchopneumonia. But it's baby Leslie who suffered most.
It has to be a commitment. And I can't say that it's the easiest thing. It never got easier.
Marie Ziemer, a missionary herself.
They talk about pioneer missionaries. I would say the Smiths were the pioneer missionaries.
They became U.S. citizens in time, but they started life in Canada. Gordon Smith came from a sheltered upbringing in Toronto, and Laura from a family farm in Dalrymple, Ontario. Both were attracted by the romance of faraway places. The farther away, the better. When they found that they shared a dream of missionary life, they rushed to marry. Their assignment was just the sort they hoped for: to learn the French language and a stopover in Paris, and then go on to preach in mysterious Indochina. But to whom would they preach? It is likely that they had never heard of the rugged and independent hill people known as Montagnards.
I remember this group of mountain people that came down to trade with the Cambodians in the town of Kratie. And one of these people was
Douglas Smith, eldest of the Smith's three sons, was a child in Kratie.
His hair was tied up in a bun, great ivory earplugs in his ears, and he was smoking this large pipe and carrying a wicker basket as well as a large spear.
These were people very much different from the lowland Cambodians and Vietnamese.
Physically, they look very different from the Vietnamese. This is a very important thing.
Anthropologist Gerald Hickey, a friend of the Smiths, who has studied the Montagnards.
Of course, they have a culture that the Vietnamese have never basically understood. The fact that they build their houses on piling and stilts, sort of. The fact that they wear very little clothes because they're in a very hot climate. Very often, in the old days, the women never wore anything above the waist. And the Vietnamese always considered this very primitive.
The Montagnards made Gordon Smith's heart beat faster. Here was a people unto itself, utterly untouched through all its history by any notion of Christianity. The Montagnards presented a pure challenge. Gordon Smith set himself to making friends among the tribesmen, then to devising the first grammars and dictionaries of their unwritten language, then to visiting their homes in the highlands. And there he ran into trouble with the French colonial overseers of Indochina. The inflexible policy of the French was to keep the Montagnards isolated from foreigners, especially from foreign missionaries.
There was one French administrator that was dead set against him doing mission work, and I remember the day that he was summoned in by this French administrator. He was called the Résident, and I stayed in the car, but I heard sharp words coming from the office, and when my father left, he was pale. His face was as pale as a white sheet, and I later found out that the French administrator had slapped him in the face and accused him of disobeying his orders, and he was going to have to leave the Highlands.
Gordon Smith did not leave. The bureaucrat who slapped him did. Gordon Smith pressed on into the mountains.
God opened the door for us in 1934 to follow a trail 200 miles into the heart of this southern tribal area, and we settled in a little strategic town called Bahnar Tukrong.
Bahnar Tukrong was remote from the rest of the world, but to the Montagnards a center of their culture. The Smiths settled their growing family in a Montagnard-style house, and built a longhouse church, which soon attracted hill people, intrigued by these strangers from so far away. At a Christmas dinner, Gordon and Laura and their sons seemed a settled family, but comfort for themselves always gave way to the importance the Smiths attached to their mission.
One of the other things that I think a lot of missionaries might not take into consideration before they leave.
Betty Mitchell met the Smith sons at the school to which the boys were sent in Dalat, many miles away.
That the children would go to school and might not be on the same station where we would be. And so that the children would probably be separated from us for their schooling.
My darling boys, we've received your letters and we were hungry to read them. I miss you boys more now than I ever did. How are you getting along with your music now, Douglas? Leslie, sweet boy, don't you fight. Don't get your new good suit dirty on Sundays. Many hugs and kisses to my little man, Stanley. I hope you big boys are loving and kind to your little brother. Is he happy up there? Heaps of hugs and kisses, your own mommy.
Lonely as their lives were sometimes, Gordon and Laura Smith might have lived in perfect peace with the Montagnards, if only the Montagnards had been able to live in peace themselves. But one band of Montagnards or another was constantly in revolt against the French colonialists. The French demanded unpaid laborers to build roads. These villagers refused and killed a soldier. Government troops approached the high bamboo walls of the village along a narrow path lined with poisoned stakes. The tension broke only when the village headman came out to negotiate, and seeing that his people were outnumbered, surrendered some of his men to be road builders. Montagnard leader I Yukayun grew up near Banmetuan.
The French people did try to help us, but sometimes they didn't treat us well. When we worked on their plantations, they said very bad words to all Montagnard people. Sometimes they beat us. Sometimes they would pay us, but other times, especially for the building of their roads, they wouldn't pay. They would kick us and insult us. It was very bad.
Gordon and Laura Smith tried with all their might to show the Montagnards a kinder face of Western civilization. From what must have been the first trailer in Indochina, they dispensed aspirin and safety pins and genuine neighborliness. Inagong Kanul, a chieftain, was a boy when he first saw the Smiths and their trailer.
The first time I saw it, it was strange for me. It was like a big box. I still remember when he went to preach somewhere, they usually brought their pictures with them, real big pictures.
They were storytelling pictures on sheets of flannel, and the stories they told bespoke a spiritual power that touched and impressed some of the listeners. The way seemed open now a little. In the marketplace to which the Montagnards came down to do their trading, Gordon and Laura Smith began to spread the word. And if the Montagnards didn't come to the Smiths went to them, by car as far as a car could go, and then by other forms of transportation. Gordon Smith made a film to be shown at fundraising functions back home. He played the role of a Montagnard elder. Laura Smith played the visiting missionary.
May I come up to visit with you?
Well, it's up to you.
See all these little black marks? They are the words of God talking to us from this book.
What do they say?
For they tell us the true story of the chief of the skies. It was God who made all the heavens. It was God who made the sun, the moon, and the stars. God made all the world. And God made all mankind. You know God made you red-brown people here in the jungle, too.
No, he didn't make us Rad-A people. We came out of a hole in the ground. You can go over and see it. It's called Tơdrong. We sacrifice buffalo over there every year.
God, the great chief of the skies, sent his only Son down to this earth, the Lord Jesus Christ, to die on that cross, a sacrifice once and for all. This is the only sacrifice God will accept.
Tell him to chase the demons out of that old banyan tree out there.
You think there is a demon in that magnificent banyan tree?
There's another one down there in the whirlpool, too.
Listen, he can set you free from the devil's power.
I've got a better way. I'll take this new Yang. Yang
Yesu priest.
Yesu. I'll accept his sacrifice. And then he won't be angry at me. And then I'll keep my own animal sacrifice. And then the demons won't be angry at me. And then I'll have them both, and I'll be sure. Of course, you'll pay my taxes, won't you?
I became a Christian when I heard Mr. Smith preach. He taught me to know God. We often saw at that time Mrs. Smith play the piano, and Mr. Smith would teach us how to sing. They even sang in Rade.
For centuries, the Montagnards had believed in the power of blood sacrifice to appease the gods. And so the Smiths' message of a God who made a great sacrifice for human beings struck a powerful chord in these mountains. But of course, the Smiths wanted to do much more than merely graft their religion to that of the Montagnards. They wanted to plant the seeds of the true faith and see it develop native roots and grow into a sturdy tree of Montagnard Christianity.
Christians at Bun Tung Ju are giving their tithes of the rice harvest to the Lord. Look at it all. See their native preacher in the red sweater. He's going to have enough rice for a whole year. This is establishing the native church. Some newly converted that very day gave us their sacrificial bracelets.
The bracelets were tokens of blood sacrifices the villagers had made. Those who gave up their bracelets gave up the past.
The mountain tribal people were not Buddhists or Confucianists or ancestor worshippers. They're animists, spirit worshippers.
Stanley Smith, Gordon and Laura's youngest son, later became a missionary himself.
They believe that the blood of the animal, whether it's a chicken, a pig, or a water buffalo, must be offered to the spirits to bring good health, good luck, and good crops. The spirits must be appeased, and it is only accomplished by the shedding of blood.
Oh, demons of the north, south, east, and west, demons big and little, demons of the trees, rocks, and whirlpools, come see the blood of this pig and chicken and give us good crops. Make the rains come. Don't let the monkeys, the civet cats, the deer, the wild boar, or the peacocks ravish our young sprouts.
We sacrifice buffalo to appease all kinds of spirits, mountain spirit, tree spirit, earth spirit, to get them to help us. When we were sick or had family problems, we sacrificed a buffalo. We lived in such remote areas, we had no access to medicines. These customs were all that we could rely on for help.
The water buffalo is precious to the farmers of Southeast Asia. Worker, companion, symbol, and source of wealth. The buffalo often comes to be very like a member of the family. To sacrifice a buffalo is a sacrifice indeed.
come there, they'll say, oh, that is the able part of the whole thing. But for us, it's the culture.
Pierre Cabrieux is a Montagnard who worked for the South Vietnamese Ministry of Ethnic Minorities.
And if during the sacrifice, that's the only time that the children are allowed to use the gong. But if you don't do any sacrifice, you are not allowed to touch all of those things. It's taboo. And then the children never have a chance to learn their own culture and to learn their own tradition.
Our tribespeople saw off their top front teeth. This hideous custom was one of the rites of passage into manhood and into womanhood. We are the first white people, to our knowledge, to ever see this secret operation. And of course it has never been photographed before. This little 10-year-old girl in a few minutes will undergo this cruel operation. This is heathenism. The horrors of heathenism must be revealed in all honesty. Boys and girls in our tribe's land all go through this horrible ordeal. The gospel alone can do away with this devilish practice. We must do something about it. Burning sticks with hot black lacquer dripping from them are brought to her. She rubs this into her bleeding gums to cauterize them, to help allay some of the pain in her 6 open, jumping teeth nerves. Her face swells up, and from now on her facial features will be quite changed.
If you don't do that, then women won't like you. He's much more handsome when he do that rather than to keep all of his teeth. Of course, it's terrible. We look, it's terrible, but that's what that time, and it's a la mode.
When I was a young boy, my parents tried to cut my teeth off, but fortunately, I didn't allow them to do it. My brothers did not cut their teeth off, but my sisters did. We weren't forced to abandon our old customs. We changed because we understood things would be better. It was because of our increased knowledge that we changed.
We're not going anywhere to change culture. Now, if by their accepting the truths, Christian truths that are absolutes, there are some changes, then it would be along the lines of the absolutes taught in Scripture. Not necessarily that the Westerner would come in and say, now this is the way it should be done. We have no right to do that.
If I were to go in as a missionary and projecting myself as a missionary, I would find it very difficult to go in and simply say, well, I'm going to tell you to get rid of all of the religious beliefs that you already have, because I'm going to bring you a whole new set of beliefs and values that are religious. This could be very disrupting for them. It could be very disorienting. And it could lead to a good deal of chaos in their lives.
Because our culture is more or less mingled with the belief. And so if you don't draw the line, then what? You lose it. And then if the father loses it, then the son will lose the whole thing. And then in 10 years, then the whole culture is lost.
It is true that the schools formed by the missionaries had a dramatic impact on Montagnard culture.
Now, the role of the missionaries here was very important, because a number of the people who were the leaders and beginning to express very strong discontent at what they considered discrimination against them and persecution in some cases, said, you know, the missionaries, the Catholics and the Protestant missionaries alike, told us that in the eyes of God, all men are equal. And they said, therefore, we're equal to the Vietnamese. They said they may be considered more civilized than we are, but we're as good as they are, and we're equal to them. We want to be treated like people with equality. And this really was a very strong motivation in the movements that began to grow in the highlands.
Tôi người đào kiển lê duyên
In 1941, Vietnamese and Montagnards, missionaries and French colonialists all found themselves overwhelmed by battalions of Japanese troops. Gordon Smith and his family were expelled from Vietnam.
June of 1941, we joined our parents down in Saigon, and as we boarded the evacuation ship, it was the French liner, the Maréchal Joffre, we left Saigon Harbor and went down the river, and as we went down the river, we passed troop ship after troop ship, just loaded to the gunwales with troops. It was a huge military buildup.
The war years away from the mission fields gave Gordon and Laura Smith time to write about their experiences and to think about them. Influenced by studies in anthropology, Gordon Smith began to change his view of how missionaries should work. He decided his approach had been flawed by lack of understanding. He wrote this:
"The missionary among primitives, unless he has studied them scientifically, knows little about his people, except in a theological sense. He approaches his people with his Western conception of things, not theirs, and he is bound to make blunders. He hates their gods and horrible practices. He is impatient with their superstitions."
When I met him in the 50s, he already had this interest in anthropology and going in and learning about the cultures, and he had a strong feeling for culture. He'd always felt, he told me later on, that you simply couldn't concern yourself with just going in and bringing the word of the Bible and the Word of God to the people in a place like the Central Highlands, that they were faced with a lot of problems day to day, and so he felt that he had a responsibility to try and help them as much as he could.
It was not until January 1947 that we were able to return to our jungles after the war. With us, we had some necessary tools: a Dodge car and a Stinson plane. We found the land torn by internal strife and political chaos. The great country districts were still in the hands of the Viet Minh. This meant that travel was very difficult and dangerous. We found a plane indispensable in this time of war. The commerce of the country moved in long military convoys, and these were often attacked. Home at last. We were happy to be back among our brown-skinned jungle folk again.
Rebellion against French control was spreading in Vietnam. To try to head it off, the French ceded nominal control of the highlands to the Vietnamese emperor, Bao Dai.
This is an historic occasion, as for the first time His Majesty Bao Dai, Chief of State for Vietnam, shared with the French High Commissioner the expression of loyalty of these tribes. Henceforth, these mountaineers of Indochina come under the direct supervision of His Majesty Bao Dai.
Elaborate ceremonies were held in allegiance to the emperor. But Ho Chi Minh's communist guerrillas were on the march through the countryside. Vietnam was about to be shattered by all-out war between the Viet Minh and the French. Gordon Smith, wishing only to minister to the Highlanders, managed to preserve his neutrality.
The French military suspected us of being the forerunners of an American takeover, and we had to live down this absurd notion. We were told that they were trying to discredit our mission in Indochina and have us put out. If we showed friendship with the French, the Vietnamese suspected us of upholding the French colonial policy. So we had to walk a precarious line and keep out of politics entirely.
In the early 1950s, some evangelical Protestant missionaries saw that saving souls wasn't enough.
dal và phần có rơ tầng lặng làm mình quạt và cả tiếng gì nhà tập phim của Montagnard Smith Sons of Gordon Smith History Reason documentary nói tiếng chung này để cắt quạt lệ đằng Âu và cả đi đằng miền Mai đi đằng để nắp tầng phần và phần rơ phần gờ lăng những truh cái đi đại im lăng cả lăng Tơdrong nó đal và im có rơ liên lạc bảo vệ về tam đội im liên lạc ai mẹ để nắp phần của rơ tập bộ phần lớn